"I can't lose you too," James Winters whispered against the howling storm, his arms wrapped desperately around Rebecca as hurricane winds tried to tear her from the shattered lighthouse window. 60 feet below, jagged rocks waited like hungry teeth in the darkness. Just hours earlier, she had risked everything climbing 6 stories through a collapsing lighthouse during a Category 3 storm to save 23 strangers aboard a sinking container ship. The woman who had arrived at this remote island as nothing more than a desperate job applicant was now the only thing standing between a decorated Coast Guard captain and complete emotional destruction. But here's what nobody knew: not the Coast Guard crews racing through the tempest, not the ship's crew they'd just saved, not even Rebecca herself as she clung to the man she'd fallen in love with. This wasn't the first time James Winters had held someone he loved in a lighthouse during a deadly storm. 3 years ago, in these same treacherous waters, he had failed to save the most important person in his world. That failure had driven him into isolation so complete that seasoned mariners called him the Storm Walker, a ghost who guided ships to safety but could never save himself. So what was different about this night? What had changed in the months since a broke marine biologist with nothing left to lose had answered a job posting that 19 others had fled from in terror? Subscribe now and get comfortable. Let me take you back to how it all began, to a desperate choice that would either destroy 2 broken souls or forge them into something unbreakable. The fluorescent lights of the cramped Boston apartment buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting a sickly yellow glow over the stack of unpaid bills that had become Rebecca Torres's daily torment. She sat cross-legged on her second-hand futon, her laptop balanced precariously on a pillow, scrolling through job listings that all seemed to require the one thing she didn't have: connections. 3 months. 3 months since the university had restructured her research position, 3 months of watching her savings evaporate like morning mist. Her marine biology PhD, earned through years of night classes and weekend lab work, felt worthless in a world that valued who you knew over what you knew. The apartment was barely 400 square feet, with walls so thin she could hear her neighbor's television through the night. The refrigerator hummed apologetically, containing little more than expired yogurt and a wilted salad she'd been rationing for 3 days. This morning, she'd faced the familiar choice that had become her reality: pay for electricity or buy groceries. The lights were still on, which meant dinner would be another sleeve of crackers and tap water. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father: "Don't worry about the medical bills, Mija. I'll figure something out." But Rebecca knew the truth behind his brave words. The chemotherapy treatments were draining what little retirement savings he had, and the insurance company found new ways each month to deny coverage for experimental treatments that might extend his life. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her father had worked 2 jobs to put her through school, believing education would give her opportunities he'd never had. Now, with his cancer advancing and her career stalled, she felt like she was failing him in the most fundamental way. The employment office was a study in bureaucratic indifference, with its rows of worn plastic chairs and the persistent smell of coffee and disappointment. Rebecca clutched her resume, now soft from folding and unfolding, and approached the desk where Mrs. Patterson presided over the job seekers with the enthusiasm of someone reading obituaries. "Dr. Porres, isn't it?" Mrs. Patterson barely looked up from her computer screen, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that had become the soundtrack to Rebecca's recent life. "Still looking for something in your field?" Rebecca's fingers tightened around her portfolio. "There has to be something. I can research, analyze, manage projects, 5 years of marine research experience, plus my doctorate." "Limited practical experience," Mrs. Patterson interrupted, as if Rebecca's years in university labs and field research stations counted for nothing. "Most employers want someone who's worked in the private sector, someone with industry connections." "I'm willing to start anywhere," Rebecca said, hating the desperation she heard in her own voice. "I can adapt to any marine science position." Mrs. Patterson's eyes suddenly gleamed with something that might have been malicious amusement. "Well, actually, there is one position. Been sitting here for 6 months. Good pay, too. $90,000 annually plus room and board. Live-in marine research assistant for a private lighthouse station. Rebecca's heart leaped. That salary would cover her father's treatments, pay off her student loans, finally give her a chance to get ahead instead of just surviving. That sounds perfect. Why hasn't anyone taken it? The older woman's smile turned sharp. Because it's working for Captain James Winters. The name hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Everyone in the maritime community knew about James Winters, the decorated Coast Guard captain who'd inherited his family's lighthouse operations and somehow made them more ruthless than ever. The man who'd lost his daughter in a rescue mission gone wrong and retreated to a remote lighthouse station like a wounded animal. They called him the Stormwalker, said he'd lost his humanity somewhere in the North Atlantic waves. I've heard of him, Rebecca said carefully. Household management for a lighthouse research station, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice almost sing-song now. Weather monitoring, marine data collection, equipment maintenance. But here's the thing, she leaned forward conspiratorially. The longest anyone's lasted is 3 weeks. Most don't make it past the first day. Rebecca stared at the job posting. The salary figure seemed to mock her from the page. What exactly happened to the others? Mrs. Patterson shrugged with practiced indifference. He's demanding, perfectionist, cold as a Maine winter, they say. Some quit because of the isolation. The lighthouse is 40 miles from the nearest town. Others couldn't handle his standards. Word is he expects perfection in everything and has zero tolerance for mistakes. But the work itself, the work's legitimate enough. Weather data collection, marine life monitoring, equipment calibration, important stuff for shipping safety. But Winters, Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped. Between you and me, I think he just likes watching people break, sees how much they can take before they run. Rebecca thought about her father's tired voice on the phone that morning, insisting he was fine when she could hear the pain he was trying to hide. She thought about the eviction notice tucked in her purse, the student loan payments she'd already deferred twice, the slow erosion of all her dreams. What would the day-to-day responsibilities involve, she asked. Monitoring weather patterns, collecting ocean temperature data, maintaining scientific equipment, coordinating with Coast Guard stations. You'd be his research assistant, essentially. But you'd be living on a remote island with a man who's been alone for 3 years and reportedly prefers it that way. The smart thing would be to walk away. The safe thing would be to wait for something normal, something that wouldn't require entering what sounded like a beautiful prison. But Rebecca looked at her worn shoes, remembered the empty refrigerator, thought about her father facing his next round of chemotherapy alone.
"I'll take it,"
she said. Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. You sure about that, honey? I mean, I admire the courage, but…
"I'll take it,"
Rebecca repeated, her voice firmer now. When do I start? Well, Mrs. Patterson said, printing out forms with obvious reluctance. Transportation to the station leaves from Portsmouth tomorrow morning. But Dr. Torres, I feel obligated to tell you, this isn't just about handling a difficult boss. It's about surviving complete isolation with someone who's… She paused, searching for words. Let's just say the isolation has affected him. Are you sure you're prepared for that? Rebecca signed her name with steady hands. I'm prepared for whatever it takes. The ferry to the lighthouse station cut through the grey Atlantic waters like a knife through silk, carrying Rebecca away from everything familiar toward an uncertain future. The boat captain, weathered and grizzled from decades at sea, helped her load her 2 battered suitcases, everything she owned in the world, and cast curious glances her way. You the new research assistant? He asked as they pulled away from Portsmouth Harbour. Yes, sir. He whistled low. Rather you than me, miss. That lighthouse is beautiful, but it's not a place for everyone. 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by some of the most treacherous waters on the east coast. And Winters. He shook his head. Man's been alone out there for 3 years. Some say the isolation's gotten to him. As they traveled farther from shore, Rebecca watched the mainland disappear into a thin line on the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional seabird or distant ship. The reality of her choice began to settle in. She was traveling to one of the most isolated places on the eastern seaboard to work for a man with a reputation that made experienced mariners nervous. What do you know about Captain Winters? she asked. The captain was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was one of the best Coast Guard officers I ever saw, saved more lives than most people meet in a lifetime. But that last rescue mission, he trailed off. Lost his daughter in a storm trying to save a family whose boat went down. Been different ever since. Runs that lighthouse station like it's a military operation now. The lighthouse appeared on the horizon like a white sentinel against the grey sky, standing on a rocky outcrop that rose from the water like a fortress. As they drew closer, Rebecca could see it was a masterpiece of restoration, pristine white walls, gleaming brass fixtures, and a massive lens at the top that could guide ships for miles. But despite its beauty, something about it felt forbidding, like a beautiful prison surrounded by churning water and endless sky. "There she is," the captain said. "Most isolated lighthouse station in New England. Winters keeps it running perfectly, I'll give him that. Never missed a weather report, never failed to warn ships about dangerous conditions, but living there," he shook his head again, "that's something else entirely." As they approached the small dock, Rebecca could see a figure emerging from the lighthouse. Even at a distance, there was something commanding about his posture, the way he moved with purpose and precision. This was Captain James Winters, the man who would determine whether she sank or swam in the next chapter of her life. The boat captain helped her onto the dock with obvious reluctance. "You sure about this, miss? I could take you back to Portsmouth, no questions asked." Rebecca shouldered her bag and looked up at the lighthouse towering above them. "I'm sure." But as the ferry pulled away, leaving her alone on the rocky island with a man she'd never met, Rebecca wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. The lighthouse stood before her like a challenge, beautiful and imposing, holding secrets she couldn't yet comprehend. Captain James Winters approached with measured steps, his presence somehow filling the space around him. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with prematurely grey hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. His movements were economical, precise, like someone who'd learned to waste nothing, not energy, not words, not trust. "Dr. Torres," he said, his voice deep and controlled, "I trust the journey wasn't too difficult." "No, sir. The weather was favorable." He studied her with those storm-grey eyes, taking inventory in a way that made her feel like she was being assessed for worthiness. The previous assistant found the work challenging. Marine data collection requires absolute precision. There's no room for error when lives depend on accurate weather reporting. "I understand the importance of accuracy in scientific research." "Good." He turned toward the lighthouse, expecting her to follow. "Your quarters are on the second level. We begin work at dawn. We monitor weather patterns, ocean temperatures, marine life migrations, and equipment maintenance. Data is transmitted to the Coast Guard and National Weather Service every 6 hours. Miss a transmission, and ships could be caught unprepared in dangerous conditions." Inside, the lighthouse was even more impressive than its exterior suggested. Everything was polished wood and brass, with state-of-the-art meteorological equipment alongside traditional maritime instruments. But like everything else about this place, it was perfect in a way that felt somehow empty, as if no one actually lived here rather than just existed here. The previous assistants, Rebecca found herself asking as they climbed the spiral staircase, what exactly made them leave? James paused, his expression unreadable. "They found the isolation challenging, and I have specific standards for data collection and facility maintenance. When lives are at stake, good enough isn't acceptable." He showed her to a room that was larger than her entire Boston apartment, with its own bathroom, a small sitting area, and windows that looked out over the station's grounds. It was beautiful, comfortable, and somehow felt like the most luxurious prison cell she'd ever seen. "This will be your quarters," he said. "I'll expect you in the weather station at 5:30 tomorrow morning. We'll review procedures and begin your orientation." As he turned to leave, Rebecca called after him, "Captain Winters, what should I expect?" "In terms of the work, I mean." He studied her for a long moment, and she caught a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or maybe disappointment. "Most people find the requirements restrictive, Dr. Torres. We'll see how you adapt." After he left, Rebecca sat on the bed and looked around her new home. Through her window she could see lights in what must be James's study at the top of the lighthouse. He was there, just floors above her, the man who would determine whether she survived or joined the growing list of those who'd fled this beautiful isolation. But as she unpacked her few belongings, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. This was her chance, her opportunity to prove herself and earn enough to save her father. All she had to do was survive James Winters and the isolation of the most remote lighthouse station in New England. How hard could it be? The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 5:15 a.m., but Rebecca was already awake, had been for the past hour, staring at the ceiling and rehearsing conversations that might never happen. Her first full day, her first real test, her first chance to prove that she wasn't like the others who'd fled before her. She dressed carefully in her best professional outfit, a navy blazer and slacks that she'd worn to every important interview for the past 3 years. It was showing its age, but it was clean and pressed, and it made her feel like someone who belonged in a place like this, even if she wasn't entirely sure she did. The lighthouse was tomb quiet as she made her way to the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors despite her efforts to move silently. Everything was exactly as James had described the night before: coffee maker on the counter, premium beans in the cabinet, a precise schedule that left no room for error. 5:45 a.m. Coffee ready. Black, no sugar. She'd barely finished preparing when she heard footsteps on the main staircase, measured, deliberate, the sound of someone who expected the world to arrange itself around his schedule. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she poured the coffee into the fine china cup, but she forced them steady. First impressions mattered, especially when you were trying to survive in a place that had claimed so many others. James Winters entered the kitchen at exactly 5:46 a.m. In the soft morning light, he looked different from the commanding figure who'd met her at the dock. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and his dark hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it. He was tall, she noticed again, with the kind of presence that filled a room even when he wasn't trying. Dr. Torres. His voice was deep, controlled, giving nothing away. "I trust you found your accommodations satisfactory." "Yes, sir. Thank you." She held out the coffee cup, noting how his fingers brushed hers as he took it. His hands were cold, she noticed, but steady. He sipped the coffee, his expression unchanging for a moment that stretched like eternity. Then, the morning routine is essential to maintaining accurate data collection. Consistency and timing ensures we don't miss critical weather changes. "Of course, most people find the rules restrictive," he said, watching her over the rim of his cup. There was something in his tone, not quite a challenge, but certainly a test. Rebecca had memorized the extensive list of procedures he'd given her, 47 specific guidelines covering everything from the proper calibration of instruments to the exact temperature his coffee should be maintained at. No music during work hours, no personal phone calls on the weather station equipment, no rearranging of furniture without explicit permission, no entering his private study without invitation. "I find structure helpful," she said simply. "It removes ambiguity and ensures nothing gets overlooked." Something shifted in his storm-gray eyes, surprise perhaps, or maybe the faintest hint of approval. Indeed, the next hour passed in careful coordination. She prepared his breakfast while he reviewed overnight weather data: steel-cut oats with fresh berries, whole-grain toast, fresh orange juice. He ate in methodical silence, his movements precise and economical, while she cleaned around him, maintaining the invisible boundaries that his rules had established. At 7:30, he rose to leave for the weather station. "I'll be monitoring conditions until lunch. The maintenance staff arrives at 9 of Buck. Ensure they focus on the backup generator housing. We're expecting severe weather this weekend." "Of course, sir. What would you prefer for lunch?" "Something light. Surprise me." He paused at the kitchen doorway, looking back at her. The last 3 research assistants found that particular instruction challenging. The way he said it, with slight emphasis on last 3, made it clear this was another test. She met his gaze steadily. "I enjoy challenges, Captain Winters." For the first time she saw something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "We'll see." The maintenance crew arrived precisely at 9 of Buck. two men in their 50s who introduced themselves as Bill and Frank. They were efficient, professional, and clearly familiar with the lighthouse's exacting standards. But as they worked, Rebecca noticed something else. They were cautious around anything that might be considered James's personal space. "Captain Winters is very particular about his equipment," Bill said quietly as they worked together to test the backup systems. "The last girl who worked here, she adjusted one of his weather monitoring devices maybe half an inch, and he noticed immediately, made her reset the entire calibration sequence." Frank nodded grimly. "The one before her used the wrong cleaning solution on his desk instruments. He said she was careless with details that could affect data accuracy. Gone by evening." Rebecca listened to their warnings with growing understanding. These weren't stories of a demanding employer, they were stories of a man who had turned perfection into armor, who used impossibly high standards to keep people at a distance. "What about the one before that?" she asked. The two men exchanged glances. "That was different," Bill said softly. "She lasted 3 weeks, longest anyone's made it in 4 years. What happened to her?" Frank's voice dropped to a whisper. "She tried to get personal, asked him about his family, his life before the lighthouse. Tried to be friendly, you know? He doesn't like personal questions. Fired her the next day, said she was overstepping professional boundaries. The message was clear. Do your job, don't ask questions, don't try to connect. Stay invisible, stay safe." But as Rebecca walked through the lighthouse that morning, reviewing procedures and familiarizing herself with the equipment, she found herself wondering about the man who lived in this beautiful isolation. The lighthouse was flawless, but it was also sterile. There were no personal photographs, no mementos, no signs that anyone actually lived here rather than just existed here. In the main living area, she discovered a grand piano. Its black surface was gleaming but covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been played in months. Sheet music sat on the stand, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, but it looked abandoned, forgotten. She ran her finger along the keys, not pressing hard enough to make sound, just feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. "Are you a musician, Dr. Torres?" She spun around, her heart hammering. James Winters stood in the doorway, having moved with the silence of a predator. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her hand, still resting on the piano keys. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Answer the question." She took a breath, forced herself to meet his gaze. "I played as a child. My mother insisted on lessons even when we couldn't really afford them. She said music was important, that it fed the soul. And do you believe that? That music feeds the soul?" The question seemed loaded with meaning she couldn't decipher. "I think music has the power to heal, to connect people, to express things that words can't." He stepped into the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. "Play something." "Sir." "The piano. Play something." His voice was quietly commanding, the tone of someone accustomed to obedience. "I haven't played in years, and the house rules. I'm amending the rules." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and subtle. "Play." Her hands trembled as she positioned them over the keys. "What did you play for a man who seemed to take pleasure in finding fault?" Something technical to demonstrate skill, something safe and familiar. Instead, she found herself playing from memory, her fingers finding the melody of Shenandoah, a song her mother used to hum while cooking dinner, a song that spoke of longing and journeys and the kind of everyday magic that made life worth living. The notes filled the room, tentative at first, then growing stronger as muscle memory took over. She wasn't technically perfect, her fingers stumbled over passages that would have been smooth years ago, but there was something in the music, something honest and real, that seemed to transform the sterile space around them. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like a held breath. She turned to face him, expecting criticism, expecting to be told that she'd overstepped, that she was finished. Instead, she found James Winters staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. His pale eyes seemed to hold depths she hadn't noticed before, and for a moment, the mask of cold control slipped. "My daughter used to sing that song," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, intimate and unexpected. For a heartbeat, she saw not the storm walker, but a man who'd lost something precious and hadn't figured out how to find his way back to the world. She was on the boat, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, the rescue mission that went wrong, a family caught in a sudden storm, their engine failed. We got to them, but he stopped, unable to continue. Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest, a understanding that went beyond professional sympathy. She was trying to help save them. He nodded, his throat working. 8 years old, she insisted on coming with me that day, said she wanted to see how rescue operations worked. I thought. He trailed off, lost in memory. The lighthouse, Rebecca said gently. It's not just your job, is it? It's your penance. The words were bold, dangerous, crossing every professional boundary she was supposed to maintain. But looking at him now, seeing the grief he carried like a weight that threatened to drown him, she couldn't stay silent. She would have been proud of what you do here, she said quietly. How many lives you save with your weather warnings, your storm tracking. You're still saving people, just in a different way. James looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw past the stormwalker reputation to the father who'd lost everything and spent 4 years trying to save everyone else in the only way he knew how. You're different from the others, he said finally. How so? They were afraid of me. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Should I be? Perhaps. But there was no menace in his voice, only curiosity and something that might have been relief. Lunch became a revelation. Instead of the predictable salads and sandwiches his previous assistants had served, Rebecca prepared something that required both skill and intuition. Perfectly pan-seared scallops over a bed of wild rice pilaf, accompanied by homemade focaccia bread that filled the kitchen with the scent of rosemary and sea salt. James ate in silence, but she noticed things, the way he savored the first bite, the slight nod of approval when he tasted the bread, the fact that he finished everything on his plate instead of picking at it like someone going through the motions of living. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked as she cleared his plate. My mother. She said that cooking was an act of love, that you could tell everything about a person by how they fed the people they cared about. And what does this meal tell you about me? The question caught her off guard. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the loneliness in his eyes, the perfect posture that spoke of someone always on guard. It tells me you're hungry, she said finally, not just for food, for something real. The words hung between them, bold and dangerous. She'd crossed another line, spoken a truth that violated every rule about maintaining professional distance. She waited for the explosion, for the cold dismissal, for the order to pack her things. Instead, James Winters leaned back in his chair and studied her with those storm-grey eyes. You're not afraid of me? No, sir, I'm not. Perhaps you should be. Perhaps, she echoed his earlier words. But I'm not afraid of storms, Captain Winters, and I'm not afraid of you. The days that followed established a rhythm between them, a careful dance of professional respect that gradually deepened into something approaching trust. Rebecca proved herself capable with the complex meteorological equipment, her scientific background allowing her to understand not just the procedures but the reasoning behind them. She anticipated his needs, maintained his standards, and slowly began to earn something she hadn't expected, his respect. In the evenings, after the last weather transmission of the day, she often found him on the lighthouse's observation deck, playing his guitar while watching the sun set over the Atlantic. Sometimes he played classical pieces with technical precision. Other times, he chose simpler melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper, more personal. On her 7th night, she joined him there, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into one of the deck chairs without invitation. He looked up from his guitar, surprised but not displeased. I hope you don't mind the company, she said. The company is acceptable. It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment she'd received from him, and she found herself smiling. High praise indeed. Arf, he actually smiled back, a real smile, not the polite expression he wore during their professional interactions. You've lasted longer than most. Is that what this is? A test of endurance? Everything is a test, Dr. Torres. The question is whether you're strong enough to pass." She looked out at the ocean, where the lighthouse beams swept steadily across the water, guiding unseen ships safely through the night. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." And for the first time since arriving at the lighthouse, Rebecca realized she meant it. This wasn't just about the money anymore, though her father's medical bills still demanded attention. This was about something she hadn't expected to find in this isolated place, a sense of purpose, and perhaps, if she was very careful and very lucky, the beginning of something that looked remarkably like hope. The morning of Tuesday, October 15th, began like any other at the lighthouse station. Rebecca was in the weather monitoring room, recording the overnight temperature readings and preparing the 6 a.m. transmission to the Coast Guard, when the emergency radio crackled to life with an urgency that made her blood freeze. "Mayday, Mayday. This is fishing vessel Katie's Dream, registration WH4729. We have complete engine failure and are drifting toward rocks. Our position is approximately 2 miles southeast of Gulls Point Lighthouse. We have 4 souls on board. Please respond, over." The voice was strained, desperate, fighting through static and the sound of wind and waves. Rebecca's hands flew to the radio controls, her training kicking in automatically. "Katie's Dream, this is Gulls Point Lighthouse Station. We copy your Mayday call. What is your current condition and immediate needs, over?" "Lighthouse Station, we lost our engine about 20 minutes ago. Currents are pushing us toward the rocks on the southeast side of your island. We can see them getting closer. We need immediate assistance, over." Rebecca's heart pounded as she grabbed the binoculars and rushed to the southeast window. Through the morning haze, she could make out the small fishing boat, maybe 35 feet long, being pushed relentlessly toward the jagged rocks that surrounded their island like the teeth of some ancient monster. At this rate, they had maybe 40 minutes before impact. "Stand by, Katie's Dream," she radioed back, then switched to the Coast Guard emergency frequency. "Coast Guard Station Portland, this is Gulls Point Lighthouse with an emergency traffic, over." "Gulls Point, this is Coast Guard Station Portland. Go ahead with your emergency traffic. We have a fishing vessel in distress, engine failure, drifting toward rocks southeast of our position. 4 persons on board. Vessel is Katie's Dream, registration WH4729. They need immediate assistance, over." "Roger, Gulls Point. We're launching rescue assets now. Estimated time to your location is 45 minutes. Can you maintain communication with the vessel?" 45 minutes. Rebecca looked through the binoculars again. The boat was noticeably closer to the rocks. They didn't have 45 minutes. "James," she called out, but he was already there, having heard the emergency calls from his study, and when she turned to face him, she saw something that took her breath away. The man who entered the communications room was not the controlled, precise lighthouse keeper she'd come to know. This was someone entirely different, someone who moved with the fluid confidence of a predator, whose eyes held the sharp focus of a trained rescuer. This was the Stormwalker, the legendary Coast Guard captain who'd saved more lives than most people ever met. "How many on board?" he asked, his voice crisp and commanding. 4. Engine failure, drifting toward the southeast rocks. Coast Guard is 45 minutes out. James was already moving, pulling on his heavy weather gear with practiced efficiency. "They won't make it. Current and wind will push them onto the rocks in 30 minutes, maybe less." "What are you going to do?" "What I always do." He was checking the emergency beacon on his rescue suit, testing his radio headset. "I'm going to get them." Rebecca watched in amazement as he transformed before her eyes. Every movement was purposeful, economical, the result of thousands of hours of training and experience. He grabbed the keys to the lighthouse's emergency response boat, a fast, shallow draft vessel designed specifically for these treacherous waters. "I need you on the radio," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Coordinate with the Coast Guard, track our positions on radar, and guide me through the approach. These rocks have claimed too many boats to count. I'll need your eyes and the radar to navigate safely. James, it's dangerous. Lives are at stake." He paused at the door, looking back at her with those storm-gray eyes. "This is what I do, Rebecca. This is why I'm here." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the communications room with the weight of 4 lives hanging in the balance. Rebecca watched through the high-powered telescope as James launched the rescue boat into waters that would have terrified most experienced mariners. The swells were 8 feet and building, with white caps breaking over submerged rocks that could tear the hull from any vessel. But James navigated through them like he was reading music, finding channels between the hazards that she couldn't even see. Katie's dream, this is Gull's Point rescue boat approaching from the northwest. I'm Captain Winters. What's your current situation? Captain, thank God. We're taking on water through a loose fitting, and we can hear the rocks. We've got 2 adults and 2 kids on board. The kids are scared. Rebecca's heart clenched at the mention of children. She thought of James's daughter, lost in similar circumstances, and understood why he was risking everything to reach them. Roger, Katie's dream, I'm going to approach from your port side and take you under tow. I need everyone to remain calm and follow my instructions exactly. We're going to get you out of this. For the next 2 hours, Rebecca became James's lifeline to safety. She tracked both vessels on radar, calling out positions and hazards as he maneuvered through the treacherous waters. Her voice became his constant companion, guiding him around submerged rocks, warning him of changing currents, coordinating with the Coast Guard cutter that was racing toward their position. James, you've got a submerged ledge about 50 yards to your starboard. Radar shows it's maybe 3 feet down. Copy that. I see the watercolor change. Adjusting course. Coast Guard cutter is now 15 minutes out. They're requesting your position for rendezvous. Tell them we'll meet them in the deep water channel, bearing 290 from the lighthouse. She watched through the telescope as James secured a tow line to the disabled fishing boat, his movements sure and confident even in the rough seas. The rescue boat's engines strained against the additional load, but slowly, steadily, he began pulling the Katie's dream away from the rocks and toward safety. Rebecca, I need a bearing to the deep water channel. This tow is affecting my compass. Bearing 285 degrees from your current position. You're doing great, James. Coast Guard reports they have visual contact. Copy. Tell the fishing boat crew we're almost home. When the Coast Guard cutter finally took over the tow and James began his return to the lighthouse, Rebecca felt her legs give out. She sank into a chair, suddenly aware that she'd been standing rigid with tension for over 2 hours, her hands cramped from gripping the radio microphone. But more than physical exhaustion, she felt something else, a profound shift in how she saw the man she'd been working with for 3 weeks. She'd known intellectually that James Winters was a decorated rescue specialist, but seeing him in action, watching him risk his own life without hesitation to save complete strangers, she understood for the first time what real heroism looked like. This wasn't the cold, demanding lighthouse keeper who insisted on perfectly calibrated instruments and precise schedules. This was a man who'd found his purpose in the space between life and death, who carried the weight of every life he could save as penance for the one he couldn't. When James finally returned to the lighthouse dock, he was soaked through and exhausted, his face gray with fatigue and cold. Rebecca was waiting for him, a dry jacket and hot coffee in her hands, her heart pounding with relief and something else she didn't dare name. The family? She asked as he climbed from the boat. Safe. Coast Guard has them. The kids were scared but unharmed. He accepted the jacket gratefully, his hands shaking slightly from cold and adrenaline. The father thanked me about 20 times. Said his daughter was the same age mine would have been. The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded, and Rebecca felt her carefully maintained professional distance crumble completely. This wasn't just about the money anymore, hadn't been for days, if she was honest with herself. Watching him risk everything to save strangers, seeing the quiet heroism he carried every day like a burden and a gift, she understood why she'd really stayed. It wasn't the salary that kept her here, it was him. You saved their lives, she said as they walked back toward the lighthouse. We saved their lives, he corrected, stopping to look at her directly. I couldn't have navigated those waters safely without your guidance. You were my eyes when I was flying blind. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither had expected to find in this isolated place. Rebecca felt the shift as clearly as a change in the weather, the recognition that they had moved beyond professional partnership into something deeper, more personal. I've never seen anything like what you did out there, she said quietly. It's what I'm trained for, what I'm good at. No, it's more than that. You didn't just rescue them because it was your job. You did it because you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't try." James studied her face, and she saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Most people don't understand that. Most people haven't lost someone the way you have, Rebecca." Before he could finish, the emergency radio crackled again. Another vessel in distress, this time a yacht with mechanical problems in the shipping channel. The moment between them dissolved as James immediately shifted back into rescue mode, but something fundamental had changed. As they worked together through the afternoon, coordinating another successful rescue operation, Rebecca found herself watching James with new eyes. She noticed how he never hesitated when lives were at stake, how he carried the responsibility for every ship that passed through these waters like a sacred trust. She saw the man behind the reputation, the father behind the Stormwalker legend, and she realized that what had started as a desperate grab for financial stability had become something she'd never expected, the beginning of understanding what it meant to truly admire someone, to see their strength and their scars, and love them not despite their wounds, but because of how they'd chosen to heal. That evening, as they completed the day's final weather transmission, James turned to her with an expression she'd never seen before, something that might have been gratitude mixed with wonder. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what? For being here, for staying, for—" He paused, searching for words, "for seeing me." Rebecca felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "James, I know this is complicated. I know I'm not easy to work with or be around, but today, having you there—" He trailed off, then tried again. "I haven't had a partner in 4 years. I'd forgotten what it felt like to trust someone completely." The word partner hung between them, loaded with meanings that went far beyond professional collaboration. Rebecca understood that they were standing at a crossroads, that whatever happened next would determine not just their working relationship, but something much more profound. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with the job and everything to do with the man standing before her. For the first time since she'd arrived at the lighthouse, James Winters smiled, not the polite expression he wore during their professional interactions, but something real and unguarded and beautiful. "Neither am I," he said, and Rebecca knew that everything was about to change. 2 months after the fishing boat rescue, Rebecca had settled into a rhythm at the lighthouse that felt almost like home. She and James had developed an easy partnership, their professional respect deepening into something that felt dangerously close to friendship. But on the evening of December 18th, nature reminded them both just how precarious their isolated existence could be. The storm had been building for 3 days, starting as a minor weather disturbance off the coast of Nova Scotia before intensifying into what meteorologists were calling a bomb cyclone, a winter hurricane that could produce winds exceeding 100 miles per hour and waves tall enough to swallow buildings. Rebecca had never experienced anything like it. She'd lived through nor'easters and blizzards during her years in Boston, but this was something altogether different, a force of nature that made their lighthouse station feel like a matchstick in an ocean of fury. Sustained winds at 95 miles per hour, gusting to 120, James reported into the Coast Guard radio as another massive wave crashed against the lighthouse's foundation, sending spray 40 feet into the air. Visibility near zero. Recommend all vessels seek immediate shelter. He'd been at the weather station for 18 hours straight, coordinating with rescue teams up and down the coast as the storm claimed disabled boats and overwhelmed harbors. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, his voice hoarse from constant radio communication, but he refused to rest while ships were still struggling in the tempest. Rebecca brought him another cup of coffee, noting how his hands shook slightly as he accepted it. "James, you need to sleep, even for an hour." "Can't." He gestured toward the radar screen, which showed 3 vessels still struggling in the shipping channel. "The Northern Star is a container ship trying to make Portland. If they get pushed off course in this wind—" He didn't need to finish. The rocks that surrounded their island had claimed dozens of ships over the decades. At 11:47 p.m., their worst fears materialized. A massive wave, larger than any they'd seen during the storm, struck the lighthouse with the force of a freight train. The entire structure shuddered, and Rebecca heard a sound that made her blood freeze, the distinctive crack of breaking glass from somewhere high above them. "The primary beacon," James said, his face going pale as he checked the lighthouse controls. "The lens assembly is damaged. We've lost the main light." Rebecca looked out at the storm-tossed ocean, where the Northern Star was fighting to maintain course against winds that wanted to push her toward the rocks. Without the lighthouse beacon, the massive container ship would be sailing blind through some of the most dangerous waters on the East Coast. "Backup light?" she asked. "Failed. Generator's been struggling all day." James was already moving, checking systems, trying to find an alternative. "There's a manual restart procedure for the main beacon, but someone would have to get to the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse." Rebecca looked up through the lighthouse's central shaft, where she could see the darkened lamp room 6 stories above them. Even from here, she could hear the wind howling through the damaged structure, could see debris being flung past the windows. "I'll go," James said, reaching for his storm gear. "No." Rebecca's voice was firm, surprising them both. "Look at yourself, James. You've been working for 18 hours. You're exhausted. One mistake up there and you're dead." "Rebecca, it's too dangerous. That ship out there has 23 people on board," she interrupted, having heard their earlier radio communication. "You're needed down here coordinating rescue efforts. I know the beacon system. You trained me on it last month." James stared at her, conflict warring in his storm-gray eyes. She could see him calculating the risks, weighing the probability of success against the cost of failure. "The wind speeds up there will be twice what they are down here. The lamp room has windows on all sides. If one fails while you're up there, then I'd better work fast." Rebecca was already reaching for the heavy weather gear, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. "Those people are counting on us, James. All of us. I can't lose you too." The words slipped out before he could stop them, raw and honest, and loaded with meaning that went far beyond professional concern. Rebecca felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of what he'd just admitted, and what she'd been trying not to acknowledge for weeks. "You won't," she said, meeting his eyes. "Trust me." The climb up the lighthouse's spiral staircase felt endless, each step a battle against the wind that howled through every gap in the structure. The lighthouse swayed with each massive gust, metal groaning and creaking like a ship in heavy seas. Rebecca's legs burned with the effort, her breathing labored as she fought her way upward through air that felt thick as soup. By the time she reached the 5th floor, the wind was so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. Debris rattled against the windows, pieces of wood, seaweed, fragments of boats that had been torn apart by the storm. The lighthouse's entire structure vibrated like a tuning fork, and Rebecca had to grip the handrail to keep from being thrown against the walls. "Rebecca, status report." James's voice crackled through her radio, barely audible over the storm. "Almost there," she gasped, forcing herself up the final flight of stairs. "The whole structure is moving. I can feel it swaying. Just get the beacon restarted and get out of there. The Northern Star is less than a mile from the rocks." The lamp room was a nightmare of wind and broken glass. One of the eastern windows had completely failed, leaving a jagged opening that howled like a banshee as hurricane-force winds tore through the space. Rain and spray lashed through the breach, making the floor treacherous with water and glass fragments. Rebecca fought her way to the beacon control panel, her hands numb with cold as she worked through the restart sequence James had taught her. The primary switch was located near the damaged window, and with each step toward it, the wind tried to lift her off her feet. "Manual restart initiated," she radioed back, her voice barely carrying over the storm. "Beginning lamp sequence now." The beacon's massive lens assembly groaned to life, the Fresnel lens beginning its slow rotation as the emergency lighting system engaged. For a moment, Rebecca felt a surge of triumph. They'd done it. The light was working, and the Northern Star would have the guidance it needed to navigate safely around the rocks. Then the southern window exploded. The blast of wind and glass hit Rebecca like a physical blow, sending her stumbling toward the jagged opening where the window had been. She felt herself being lifted, pulled toward the 60-foot drop to the rocks below, her feet losing contact with the floor as the hurricane tried to claim her. "This is how it ends," she thought with strange clarity. This is how James's daughter felt in those final moments. But then strong arms closed around her waist, pulling her back from the precipice just as she felt herself going over the edge. James's voice shouted her name, though she could barely hear it over the storm, and she found herself pressed against his chest as he dragged her away from the deadly opening. "The beacon," she gasped, her body shaking from adrenaline and terror. "Is working," he said, holding her tight as the light swept across the storm-tossed sea. "You did it. The ship is safe." They clung to each other in the ruined lamp room, wind and rain lashing around them, and Rebecca realized that something profound had just happened. She had risked everything to save lives James cared about, and he had risked everything to save her. In that moment of absolute terror and absolute trust, every wall they'd built between them came crashing down. "I thought I'd lost you," James whispered against her hair, his voice rough with emotion she'd never heard from him before. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered back, her hands fisting in his jacket. "Not anymore. I can't do this alone anymore," he said, the words torn from him like a confession. "I can't be alone anymore." Rebecca pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, seeing vulnerability there that took her breath away. This wasn't the controlled lighthouse keeper or the legendary storm walker. This was just a man who'd been carrying too much weight for too long, who'd found someone willing to share the burden. "You don't have to be," she said softly. "I love you," he said, the words coming out in a rush as if he'd been holding them back for weeks. "I didn't think I could feel this way again. I didn't think I deserved to feel this way again. I love you too," she replied, her heart full to bursting, "more than I ever thought possible." The kiss happened naturally, inevitably, as the storm raged around them and the lighthouse beam swept steadily across the water, guiding ships safely home. It was a kiss that tasted of salt spray and terror and relief, a kiss that sealed a promise neither of them had dared to make before this moment. When they finally broke apart, James rested his forehead against hers. "We should get out of here. This room isn't safe." "In a minute," Rebecca said, not wanting to let go of him, not wanting to break the spell of this moment when everything had finally become clear between them. They made their way carefully down the lighthouse stairs, supporting each other against the wind that still howled through the damaged structure. In the communications room, they confirmed that the Northern Star had safely navigated around the rocks and was continuing toward Portland. The beacon's emergency repair had saved 23 lives. But as they sat together in the relative calm of the weather station, Rebecca knew that something much more important had been saved tonight. Two people who'd thought they were too broken for love had found their way back to hope, back to the possibility of a future that didn't have to be faced alone. "What happens now?" she asked, her hand intertwined with his. James looked out at the storm, which was finally beginning to show signs of weakening. "Now we weather this storm together, and whatever comes after." "Together," Rebecca repeated, liking the sound of the word. "Together," he confirmed, bringing her hand to his lips. "For as long as you'll have me." Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation, cutting through the darkness and the storm, a beacon of hope for anyone lost in the night. But inside the lighthouse, two souls who'd been lost for far too long had finally found their way home to each other. The storm would pass, as all storms do, but what had been forged between them in the wind and rain and terror of that night would endure long after the skies cleared and the seas calmed. They had faced the ultimate test together and emerged not just alive, but transformed, no longer two isolated people maintaining professional distance, but partners in the truest sense, ready to face whatever the future might bring. The beacon light swept across the water, steady and sure, just as their love would be, a constant guide through any darkness that might come. In the aftermath of the storm, as they sat together in the communications room with the lighthouse beacon casting its steady beam across calming waters, Rebecca felt the entire world shift around them. The professional boundaries they'd maintained for months had been swept away like debris in hurricane winds, leaving something raw and honest and beautiful in their place. "I've been lying to myself," James said quietly, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, "telling myself this was just professional partnership, that I was keeping proper distance. But watching you climb those stairs tonight, knowing you might not come back," his voice broke slightly, "I realized I'd rather face any storm with you than spend another day pretending I don't love you." Rebecca felt tears she hadn't known she was holding back spill down her cheeks. "I came here for the money," she whispered, "for my father's medical bills, for a chance to get ahead, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being about survival and started being about you, about us. When did you know? He asked. The first rescue. Watching you risk everything for strangers, seeing the man behind the reputation. You weren't the Ice King everyone warned me about. You were just someone who'd been hurt so badly you'd forgotten how to let people close. She cupped his face with her free hand. But you let me close. You didn't give me much choice, he said with a soft laugh. You were fearless from the beginning, not afraid of the isolation, not afraid of my rules, not afraid of me. I was terrified of you, Rebecca admitted, not because of your reputation, but because of how you made me feel. I hadn't expected to find love in the most isolated place on earth. They spent the rest of the night talking, really talking, for the first time since she'd arrived. James told her about his daughter, about the guilt he carried, about the years of isolation that had felt like penance until Rebecca arrived and showed him that healing was possible. Rebecca shared her fears about her father's illness, her dreams of making a difference in marine conservation, her growing realization that the lighthouse had become more home than anywhere she'd ever lived. As dawn broke over the calming seas, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they made plans, not just for the immediate future, but for a life together that neither had dared to hope for just 24 hours earlier. 6 months later, Rebecca stood on the balcony of their penthouse apartment overlooking Boston Harbor, watching the distant beacon of their lighthouse sweep across the water. The apartment was a study in contrasts, modern comfort mixed with maritime antiques, James's precise organization softened by Rebecca's natural warmth. Regrets? James asked, joining her at the railing with 2 cups of coffee. About leaving the lighthouse, Rebecca considered the question as she accepted the warm mug. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, the routine, the isolation, the feeling that we were the only 2 people in the world. We can visit any time. Helen is managing the automated systems perfectly, but she says it's not the same without us there. Rebecca smiled at the thought of Helen Torres, who'd been so relieved when they announced their engagement that she'd actually cried. The assistant had confided that she'd been hoping for years that James would find someone who could reach past his walls. Besides, James continued, you're doing important work here. The climate research project is already getting international attention. Rebecca's new position as lead researcher for the New England Marine Climate Initiative was everything she'd dreamed of professionally: cutting-edge research, unlimited resources, the chance to make a real difference in understanding how ocean warming affected coastal ecosystems. But more than that, it was proof that taking the impossible job at the lighthouse had led to possibilities she'd never imagined. And you're happy with the consulting work? She asked. James nodded, looking out at the harbor where ships moved safely through channels he now helped design and maintain. Maritime safety consulting lets me use everything I learned in the Coast Guard and at the lighthouse. I'm helping shipping companies navigate safely, training rescue teams, designing better warning systems. I'm still saving lives, just from a different perspective. No more isolation, no more isolation, he agreed, pulling her closer. Though I have to admit, I enjoyed having you all to myself on that island. Rebecca laughed, remembering their early days of careful professional distance that had gradually warmed into partnership and then love. We were so formal with each other, all those rules, all that careful politeness. You broke every rule I had, James said, pressing a kiss to her temple, starting with the piano. You commanded me to play. I was testing you. I thought you'd refuse, like the others. Instead, you played that song and he trailed off, lost in memory. And you told me about your daughter. That's when I knew you were different. You didn't run when you learned about the accident. You didn't treat me like a broken thing that needed fixing. You just saw me. Their wedding had taken place on the lighthouse island on a perfect September day, with the Coast Guard chaplain officiating and a small group of friends and family in attendance. Rebecca's father, whose cancer had responded well to the experimental treatments she could finally afford, walked her down a makeshift aisle on the rocky shore. James's former Coast Guard colleagues formed an honor guard, and Helen Torres served as matron of honor, weeping openly throughout the ceremony. The lighthouse beam had swept steadily across the water as they exchanged vows, a constant reminder of where their love had been forged and tested. Rebecca had written her own vows, speaking of lighthouses as symbols of guidance and safety, of finding home in the most unexpected places, of love that could weather any storm. "I promise to be your beacon," she had said, "as you have been mine, a constant light to guide us safely through whatever storms may come." James had struggled through his own vows, his voice breaking as he promised to love and protect her, to never again face the world alone. When the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife, the lighthouse horn had sounded across the water as if the island itself was celebrating their union. Now, 10 months later, Rebecca stood in the bathroom of their Boston penthouse, staring at a small plastic test that would change their lives forever. 2 pink lines stared back at her, clear and unmistakable. She was pregnant. "Rebecca, everything okay in there?" James called from the bedroom. She took a deep breath, gathering courage for the conversation that would transform them from a couple into a family. "James, could you come here for a minute?" He appeared in the doorway, concern written across his features. "What's wrong?" Instead of answering, she held up the pregnancy test. James stared at it for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, wonder, and finally, pure joy. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "Very sure. I've been feeling different for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before." She trailed off as James crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms. "We're having a baby," he said, as if testing the words. "We're having a baby," she confirmed, laughing through tears of happiness. The pregnancy was everything Rebecca had hoped for, but never dared expect. James was attentive without being overprotective, excited without being overwhelming. He read every pregnancy book he could find, installed safety features throughout their apartment, and talked to her belly every night, telling their unborn child about the lighthouse where Mummy and Daddy had fallen in love. On a snowy February morning, Grace Hope Winters made her entrance into the world with the determination of someone who had important places to be. She was perfect, 7 pounds, 2 ounces of wrinkled perfection, with her father's storm-grey eyes and her mother's delicate features. Rebecca watched through exhausted but blissful tears as James held his daughter for the first time. The man who had been so controlled, so careful with his emotions, was completely undone by the tiny person in his arms. Tears streamed down his face as Grace wrapped her impossibly small fingers around his thumb. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "She's absolutely perfect." "What should we call her?" Rebecca asked softly. James looked out the hospital window, where snow was falling gently over Boston Harbor. In the distance, barely visible through the winter haze, the lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation. "Hope," he said. "Her name is Hope." Rebecca felt her heart swell with love so profound it was almost painful. Hope for the future they were building together, for the healing that had brought them to this moment, for the love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning. "Grace Hope Winters," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." As James settled into the chair beside her hospital bed, cradling their daughter with the reverence of someone who understood how precious and fragile life could be, Rebecca marveled at the journey that had brought them here. What had begun as a desperate job application to an impossible position had become the foundation of the most beautiful life she could have imagined. "I love you even more now," James murmured, his eyes never leaving Hope's sleeping face. "I didn't think it was possible, but watching you bring our daughter into the world, you've given me everything I never dared to dream of again." Rebecca reached over to stroke Hope's soft cheek, marveling at the tiny life they'd created together. "I used to think love was something that happened to other people, something I might find someday if I was lucky. I never expected to find it in the most isolated place on earth, with the most impossible man. Impossible to resist," she clarified with a smile. "From the moment you commanded me to play that piano, I was lost." James leaned over to kiss her forehead, their daughter nestled safely between them. "Then we were both lost together, and somehow that's how we found our way home." Outside the hospital window, snow continued to fall over the harbor, and somewhere in the distance, their lighthouse beam swept steadily across the water, a beacon of hope for anyone lost in the darkness, just as their love had become a beacon for anyone who believed that even the most broken hearts could heal, that even the most impossible situations could lead to the most extraordinary joy. Hope stirred in her father's arms, opening her grey eyes for a moment before settling back into peaceful sleep. She was the living symbol of everything they'd built together: love born from desperation, hope forged in isolation, and a future as bright and constant as the lighthouse beam that had witnessed their beginning. My family, love doesn't always arrive when we expect it or where we think we'll find it. Sometimes it comes disguised as a desperate job application to an impossible position. Sometimes it grows in the most isolated places, between two people who thought they were broken beyond repair. Rebecca took a job nobody wanted and lived the best days of her life because she was brave enough to see past someone's walls to the heart beneath. Their lighthouse still operates today, now automated, but I like to think it carries the memory of the love that bloomed there, a beacon, not just for ships but for anyone who believes that even in our darkest storms, hope can guide us home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. See you on the next one.